Добро утро и добре дошли в този много дъждовен, но все пак пролетен ден
I'm happy to see you all. Good morning, and I'm happy to see you all today on this rainy morning to talk about European elections and the threat of foreign intervention. We're going to talk today about the security of these elections. This is an aspect that is not sufficiently covered in our discussions with experts and politicians. Of course, the security of elections has a political dimension, and we are going to discuss that topic in the course of our first session. I'm extremely happy to have President Plevneliev with us today to share his views on the issue. I'm sure you are aware that he's got experience in this area, especially in elections that were attacked some years ago. Ms. Zakharieva called that she doesn't feel well and she will be replaced by Mr. Yuri Sterk. We believe that it's extremely important to have an institutional position expressed here to know what is the formal official position of Bulgarian institutions. I believe that they should be within the core of the problem solution. In the next panels, we will discuss how people's minds could be changed and towards altering the outcomes and the outcomes, how elections could be disrupted. Taking a broader view of the process and in view of the elections, they should be perceived as national elections that require taking security measures, and there are countries that take relevant measures, and there are others that somehow lag behind. Where does Bulgaria stand in that respect? What are the measures taken eventually, and to what extent is Bulgaria subject to such threats? So the conversations we are about to have here today will have a political aspect as well as the technical aspect. I believe we are about to learn some new things. So now I give the floor to President Plevneliev. You were the president of the Republic at the time when there was an interference, and you were the person that actually drew attention to the issue. What's your feeling about that today? Good morning, everyone. It is an extreme honor for me to be among you today. This is a topical issue. The elections are crucial, and they will pave the way to the European future. We are all aware of that fact. However, we have seen so many examples of election manipulations. As head of state, I have witnessed such examples. in the US, the last elections there, in the last elections in France. We know what happened with the Brexit campaign. In Germany, the data of the Bundestag members was stolen. So we have seen some very serious attempts to mislead, to disrupt, and to change people's minds. The combat is very serious, and it encompasses a very large scope of human activities. Unfortunately, the situation today is different from the one that we witnessed some years ago. I have witnessed manipulations as President of the Republic, and I have witnessed it firsthand. And we need to learn our lesson. The affair I'm talking about is called Kostimbrot, anti-constitutional act of journalists and political leaders when at the day of consideration, people were supposed to be left alone to make up their mind, and then the entire country woke up to face a huge manipulation, and the people were bombarded with fake news and with the support of the prosecutor's office and the opposition party that actually expected to have political dividends, forgetting all about the Constitution's clauses. At the very same night, I received a call from the Prosecutor General, and I responded, if you have any evidence, just do your job. But I never expected that journalists will take part in this manipulation with the sole purpose of manipulating and changing people's vote. The change amounted to 7 or 8%. So in Bulgaria, we've witnessed how manipulation can take place. The second manipulation that I've witnessed as a head of state was the largest cyber attack initiated by foreign intelligence of Russia. Sofasy, Fancy Bear was the group. There is sufficient evidence to confirm that this group is part of the military intelligence bodies. The purpose was, back in 2015, when we have local elections and a referendum, to manipulate. The cyber attack targeted the referendum. It was pain to the enemies, because the outcome of the referendum, in fact, was expected to have an impact on the election outcomes. 2 million Bulgarians left Bulgaria going west. None of them went east to Russia. None of them recognized the Russian society model representing human rights, law, the rule of law, and mainly human rights. And as head of state, I tried to find an instrument for these 2 million Bulgarians to take part in the election. However, this caused a pain to the Russians, and then I convened the National Security Council. No one during the joint press conference did not wish to point the aggressor, regardless of the evidence accumulated. We need to be more prepared for attacks of that sort. Currently, the European Union is facing the same situation. It's sort of a sandwich. On the one hand, there is the U.S. On the other side, there is Russia. Let me start with President Trump. I have never thought that the president of the U.S. Will not believe in the European project. The president of the U.S. believes in bilateral deals. He says, I want to have a deal, an agreement with Germany, with the UK. So with each statement, in fact, he is putting under question the European Union. One of the first questions that actually is raised by President Trump during his meetings during meetings with other heads of states is what on earth is this European Union? What about sovereign states? And all this is giving rise to some anti-European parties. And they are coming together to agree on some issues. These extreme statements of President Trump, in fact, raise an important issue. For so many years, for 70 years now, we have believed in the U.S. being the safeguard of peace, democracy, and progressive development. However, the U.S., is not only President Trump. The U.S. has very strong institutions and many leaders and politicians that believe in the European Union. On the other hand, we have Russia and President Putin. He has at his disposal a very strong manipulation machine. I don't believe that Putin perceives the European Union as an enemy, rather as a convenient opponent. It's not like in a warfare. An endless campaign to undermine the values of the EU, to divide the European Union, to have Trojan horses into the Union in order to make countries dependent on Russia. And I believe that President Putin is well aware, doesn't have the resources to hold a campaign against the U.S. or China. And this, however, is not the case with the EU. Unfortunately, today, the European Union, we are more registering a crisis than tackling or dealing with crisis. And President Putin is exercising his ability to show power. And unfortunately, all extreme nationalist and right-hand and populist formations, one way or the other, are connected to Russia's efforts to destabilize Europe. And the reasons are numerous. European Union still remains a unique project in the world and can have so many benefits. Who else can give Gazprom a very clear strand for development and protect other countries via which the pipelines go? You can see the iron hand of European Union imposing rules to this company in order to make sure that the natural gas is a commodity, not a leverage influence. GDPR is yet another benefit and asset. Neither UN, neither the other big countries can regulate the new industrial revolution and the new products, artificial intelligence, that have such a very strong impact on the population. The other countries never tried, but the European Union again used its iron fist. Mr. Sterka and I spoke a while ago about Israel. Israel is holding elections today, and to have an annexation of the West Bank. All the big countries kept silent. The European Union never kept silent when it's about foreign policy. And this is yet another aspect that I want to underline. And it is the European Union that deserve to have our full support and respect. It didn't come as a surprise to me seeing the extreme left, the extreme right, and the offshore bank accounts and the political party Ataka that is funded by the Russian oligarchs. Let me mark here that Marine Le Pen, Salvini, Orban, their words, in fact, coincide with Putin's words back in 2011. Europe of sovereign nations. We have UN. Do we like what is going on there? When the Security Council is unfortunately incapable to resolve any crisis, the Syrian one, for instance. We see so many crises and migration flows, and we cannot take adequate measures. It is the European Union that is the only alternative and that is capable of making a difference, and the only guarantor to have the policies we want to have implemented in the future based on values and rights, not on manipulations. The European Union deserves our support. Without the European Union, we will remain in Europe of nations, a Europe of national egoism, and a permanently destabilized, problematic Europe. If we do not want this to happen to us, let us support the EU. And now let me make a forecast. I'm basically a positive person, and I look for the good always. Being concerned with all the populistic extreme left and extreme right movements, I know that the big fight during the European elections will be of Democrats against nationalists and populists. And in their team, in Bulgaria, we have the current incumbent president of the Republic, Mr. Radev. The difference between populists and Democrats is huge. There are the people that believe in the strong people of the day. What did the five-star movement in Italy resolve? We've heard that before, but the words by the Italian party are repeated by President Radev and by Ms. Ninova. Where is Italy today after 20 years of populist ruling? Mr. Berlusconi was part of that. And finally, we had the Economist title page, picture of President Berlusconi with the words, "The man that ruined Italy." I believe that the very serious pressure imposed by the populist and nationalist will lead to a reform. What is my view of this reform? I am not a believer of United States of Europe. I do not believe that getting closer will help us very much. However, I believe in strong national states. I believe in sovereign states. European Union is built up by strong countries. Strong Germany, Bulgaria should be strong. Each member state should be strong. And I believe it is up to us to make it even stronger. It is up to us to improve the single market, to tackle cybercrime, etc., etc. And I believe we need to deepen even further our union and our relations. However, in some other dimensions, we need to have more sovereignty. So I am for a strong European Union and strong Bulgaria, and I'll do my best to make it happen. Thank you very much.
Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to convey most cordial greetings on behalf of Minister Ekaterina Zakhareva, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. And I would like to thank the organizers of today's event, the European Council on Foreign Relations, the representation of the European Commission in Bulgaria, and the European Parliament Liaison Office in Bulgaria, for this opportunity to hold the discussion today. After this rich, analytical, and comprehensive picture presented by President Plevneliev regarding the situation in the world and Europe, regarding the challenges that our societies, our countries and citizens are facing, and the challenges faced by our common European community, I think that it is hard to add anything. I, however, will try to share with you several thoughts and to present several avenues of action. First and foremost, as a representative of one of the state institutions with particular responsibilities in this respect, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also as an officer in the diplomatic service of Bulgaria, and as a citizen of Bulgaria, a member of the EU, that in recent years has consistently and persistently established its European identity, its belonging to the European cultural, economic, and legal space. And it is indeed from this perspective that I like to say that I fully share the concerns regarding the challenges faced by our societies today. In brief, we live in interesting times, and many of you know that in the Eastern cultural tradition, this is not the best time to live in. This is a time full of challenges and threats. And the threats that our countries are faced with, the challenges before our countries and the EU, were clearly outlined by President Plevneliev. But to my mind, the major threat is that a key component of the European identity has been set under pressure. This is the identity of the member states of the European Union, as well as of other communities that are out of the EU, but they are part of this economic space. We are talking here about the democratic identity of our countries. It is being subjected to doubt, to attacks, and in this way, this is an undermining of the democratic identity of the forms of governance in Europe and of the democratic identity of the EU as a whole. Because it seems to me that the modern-day European identity is built on two major pillars. One is the national identities of the countries and societies that make up this big cultural and economic unity, the European Union. The national identity includes the national traditions, the spiritual and religious heritage, and on the other hand, we have the democratic identity, which rests on the principles of a democracy of a Western type, as we establish it in the countries in Central and Eastern Europe. This democracy is based on three fundamental principles. This is representation of governance established through fair and honest and guaranteed democratic elections. This is guaranteeing the rule of law through the respective state mechanisms and the existence of a strong and operational civil society, as well as respect of the fundamental rights and freedoms, their continuous establishment and development. These are the principles on which the European democratic identity rests. And this is part of the identity that Bulgaria and the other EU member states, particularly those in Central and Eastern Europe, have been developing and establishing in the decades in which the EU has developed and has been consolidated. Today, for various reasons, both internal ones and as a result of external influences, we are witnessing a tendency where national populist sentiments cover a large portion of the societies on the European continent. They are targeting, they're focusing their actions on the national identities. They draw arguments that oppose the national interest to the European interest, which is actually in the basis of the European integration processes. So, from this hyperbolic national interest, which includes elements of non-tolerance to the different, to the others, to the aliens, is the basis for deriving arguments for non-adequacy, non-legitimacy, non-democracy of the integration processes in the European integrational space and the legitimacy of the European institutions. For some time now, we have witnessed an enhancement in these trends. Within the European Union, both on national level and on the level of European institutions, these issues are clearly identified, and it is clear what the sources of threat are. And these sources are actually generating these issues. To a large extent, the impact is related to targeted information campaigns and the generation of untrue information that is spread with the means of ITC via the social networks, via the mass media, wherever it is possible to feed in such misleading or inaccurate information. In recent years, this has been termed fake news. Obviously, the forthcoming European elections will, to a large extent, be a critical test as to the extent to which the European Union and the member states and the societies in these states are immune to or resilient to these attacks that seek to undermine the democratic identity of our societies. It is obvious that Bulgaria, as the other EU member states where European elections will be held, will not be an exception. Even on the contrary, to a large extent, it will be the object of intensive attacks during the election campaign and the election process itself. In this respect, Bulgaria, the Bulgarian institutions, the Bulgarian government are fully aware of the challenges. First and foremost, we support and participate in the actions undertaken on a European level. The European Parliament, as probably most of you know, has adopted a special strategy for the European elections and for a new political discourse. And Bulgaria fully supports this strategy and participates in its implementation. The European Union has developed and established a platform for rebutting fake news. And a European electoral network was set up for the purpose of mobilizing resources and targeted action on a national and European level to combat fake news and hybrid action by third parties aimed against the smooth electoral process vis-à-vis the European Parliament. The purpose is to minimize the damage that such actions could incur. The final outcome that may happen is that the European Union may be penetrated substantially, I would even say critically, by representatives of political forces with pronounced anti-European and anti-integrational mindsets. To a large extent, this will influence the policies of the European Union. It will slow down or stop the integrational processes in a number of areas. And in the long run, God forbid, this may lead to centrifugal forces in the European Union. The reality of such a scenario is demonstrated by the Brexit process, which is currently underway. Bulgaria is part of the common efforts to combat these trends, to enhance the immunity of our countries and societies against them. On a government level, we have established a national network under the chairmanship of Mr. Tomislav Donchev, Vice Prime Minister. In various ministries and agencies, Bulgaria will take actions and will participate in the pan-European electoral network to combat hybrid actions against the process of electing a new European Parliament. Let me point out that we are well aware of all concomitant challenges that have to do with the role and capabilities of the new technologies. We are aware that by introducing 5G technologies in the communication networks, the risk of fast and uncontrolled dissemination of information will be increased dramatically. Also, news with unchecked content, with unclear source of the content will penetrate our societies. We are working on all these issues. The required resources are set aside, and we focus our attention on these issues. It is not, however, this is a challenge that faces not only the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. All structures of the government are involved in the operations in this respect. I would like to say that this is a responsibility and a duty not only of the government institutions. This is mostly a challenge to our civil society. This is a test for its maturity. It is a responsibility for us, the Bulgarian citizens, to be capable to recognize the sources of the messages and the target of the messages and actions in the present-day complex social and political context. So I believe, as I have always believed, that the European integrational processes, the European community, the European Union, which has always withstood its positions at times of crisis, I believe that, as in the past, it will emerge with pronounced trends of extending cooperation and democracy in an increasing number of areas. I believe that in this time, once again, the union that has proved its stability and resilience will emerge stronger given the challenges it has been facing. Thank you for your attention.
Много благодаря.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of minutes for coffee break. But if you have some pressing questions, you can raise it now. I believe that we heard some very emotional and positive statements regarding European Union. And I believe that we will be hearing similar views because after the elections, we need to reinvent Europe to make sure European citizens believe more in the Union. Representing the ECFR, the Sofia office, have conducted a survey that shows some skepticism in the general view of the citizens. A key issue will be the budget, next security, border protection. So threats to the elections, apart from political and technical, we need some further aspects to consider as well. Nothing should be left to chance. If there are no questions, let's replace the panel and have a very quick coffee. And thank you very much to Mr. Plevneliev and Mr. Sterk.
Благодаря.
Thank you very much for coming back in. This is the onset of the first panel, and the panelists are here. In fact, I believe we are all aware that the European Union is in the state of war, with the final goal of being destabilized, and the media are the main arena where this war is conducted. Through the media, fake news are spread. And the media, we need to understand a wide variety of communication channels, paper, internet media, social networks, and conventional media. With respect to social media, the distinction between fake, false, untrue, half-true, etc. is rather blurred. How can we protect the forthcoming European elections from fake news and foreign interference? Let me introduce the panelists. Ralica Kovacheva, Sofia University. She's the person that understands deeply the media structure and operation. Then Nelly Ognyanova, Sofia University. She has extensive experience in various media areas, and Ms. Marjorie van den Broeke, Deputy Spokesperson at EP and Head of Press Unit. So, what do we need to do? Do we need to have a good coordination system in order to support and help people to get around the information they have access to? Or we need specific measures that can lead to specific results? So this is my first question to you.
I'm sorry, I don't speak Bulgarian, so I have to listen to the interpreters in English, and there's a bit of a time delay. What do we have to do? Well, I think for us, working at an operational level, it's important to make the definition of disinformation as simple as possible. And for us, it means information that is partially or totally incorrect and which needs addressing. Now, you mentioned coordination, first of all, and yes, indeed. We're a relatively small department in the European Parliament, although we can steer other departments. Still, we've only started doing this, but with a lot of knowledge of the past. And I would also want to emphasize that disinformation as such, it's not a new thing. I just mentioned to someone that the ancient Greeks already used it. And listen to the rhetorical speeches and you think, oh, I could learn something from that. So it's not new. What is new is that the masses and the social media which spread it so fast and so quickly and so thoroughly. But coming back to the coordination, what we have done is set up cooperation with the European Commission, the DG Communication, but also DG Connect. We had a fact-checkers conference in September last year. We also work with the Council, and the governments of the EU last December set up an action plan against disinformation, which will tie together the member states, the Commission, all the EU institutions, Parliament, to do a couple of things. But the main thing would be an exchange of alerts. A rapid alert system is being put in place. It's actually been launched, but it started now, to alert each other to disinformation, and in the future also to help each other with the information you need to counter it. And we had already set up something informal between the Commission, the External Action Service, and ourselves. By the way, can I say that the External Action Service should have been here as well, because they explicitly address disinformation coming from Russia into the neighboring states of the EU and on both sides of the border. So that is interesting what they do. Have a look at their site, EU versus Disinfo. You will find many interesting, both theoretical but also very practical instances of disinformation. So yes, coordination is very necessary, and it's what we're doing at the moment.
And how do you establish the connection between what you do and the media?
Well, in very many different ways. The media, of course, are extremely important to us. And we've always worked with media even before. And to me personally, it's very important to have very good personal relations with media and representatives of the media. What we need most of all is to be credible. If we are not credible, then we cannot do our work. So this is something that we have always done. If there's something we do not know, we will tell a journalist, I'm sorry, we will know, we will try to find out, but I cannot guarantee that I will find it. We cannot bullshit media, pardon the expression. So media are very important, also both in Brussels with the correspondents, but also in the different member states, mainly through the representation of the Commission and of the European Parliament.
This alert system, do you want it to be connected to the mainstream media, related to the mainstream media? For instance, you have an alert of disinformation, so you send, I don't know, some kind of messages to Le Monde in France or Financial Times in the UK. Sorry about the UK. And
well, I completely understand that. I even after a while, I gave up on most of the British media because either the ones.
Okay,
that
I replaced the Financial Times with the Süddeutsche Zeitung.
They're more the European media than the British media. Well, now you're going to go into very practical. If you find a piece of disinformation, what do you do? How much time do you have?
Okay, that's why I'm asking you, because
Okay.
2 months before the elections, we don't have, I believe, we don't have time to theorize, but we
So
need
what do
some
we
action.
do?
So
Well, there are a couple of things you need to do. First of all, the most important for me is to prevent it. And there the good relations with media come into play, because if you have good relations and they trust you and they come across something where they think, really, they will call you up and they will check with you. So that is super interesting. The best job we do, we cannot show because it will not have happened. We will have prevented it. So that's very important. Now, if something has been published, then what you do? And that is very difficult. We haven't found the silver bullet. We have always debunked it, countered it, but there are very good reasons. There are many neuroscience media as well which show that debunking as such doesn't really help. because if a piece of information is there, people will tend to believe it. Also, they will tend to believe it far more if it comes from their like-minded groups, the so-called bubbles, but it's people that you can identify with, that you trust at an emotional level. So if you have heard a piece of information from that particular group, and then I come there and tell them, it's not true, that's not going to help much. So that's the most difficult part of all, to really debunk it. What we do try when we do it is, apart from calling journalists that we trust and that we have good relations with, what we do try is to put something in its place. And maybe as an example, I can give you that at some point in Austria, there were a couple of articles, opinions published about the Parliament's plenary chamber. If you look at the plenary chamber and there's a debate, it's going to be, well, not even half full. I was going to try and be euphemistic. There are not many people there. And it makes sense. If you are a transport expert as an MEP, you're not going to sit in for hours listening to a debate about Syria, for instance. You have other things to do, more important things. And it happens like that in any national parliament. A debate about a topic that's not yours, you're not going to be there. You have other stuff to do. But rather than say no, because the implication was, of course, MEPs are lazy, they don't do the work, but they get paid a lot. But rather than saying, no, they're not lazy and they don't get paid a lot, because they do get paid a lot, but they do a hard job. What we wanted to show is we simply made a very short video, which is now presented to many groups, showing very short images, following up what an MEP does do while there is a plenary going on. So you see MEPs going into the plenary, but also going into a political group meeting, going into a committee meeting, talking to voters, talking to journalists, working with their assistants. And in that way, what we want to do is replace the original story without causing a confrontation, and putting in its place another story which is agreeable and which would indirectly counter the original story. So that's one way that we do it. And I think this is going to be the most important way to do it. Prevention, not only by having good media relations, but also we've developed a media literacy toolkit. The EAS, by the way, has also done that. We work together. And the same groups that can have these videos presented also, we talk to them about how do you recognize disinformation. And it's actually not that difficult. It's quite easy to recognize, but you have to know it. So those are the main things, basically prevention and countering, but in a different way, and having good media relations.
Okay. I will now ask you, Professor Ognjanova, and you feel free to participate in the discussion, but you have to put your earphones.
Oh, yes.
Възможно ли е, професор Огнянова?
Is it possible, Professor Economy, to have a centralized combat of disinformation, or to have an institutional action to counter this very deep and strong attack against the European Union?
Thank you for the question, and I thank the organizers for the invitation. I would like to start with a quote from Julian King, a member of the Security Commission. He said that European elections are coming. The media have a crucial role to play in the preparation of the public opinion. We need to act now. Today will be late. It will be later to act on the morning after the event. We all are aware of what he has in mind. This is a very clear reference to which to the way in which the people and the media responded when they learned about the results from certain events in recent years. Media are in the center of the preparation for the 2019 elections. This is proper time to look at the state of Bulgarian media. Bulgarian media are faced with a problem. There are many reasons for that. It's a long debate, but I'd like to emphasize on the following. It's very important what is the state of the rule of law, because it's very difficult to talk about just fair elections and about independent media that implement their functions in a country which is faced with issues regarding the rule of law. In this respect, European institutions have a very important role to play. If we talk even about the latest events, you will remember that in the beginning of April, on the 2nd or 3rd of April, a communication of the European Commission was published that a discussion is opened to consider the tools of the EU in terms of the consolidation of the rules of the rule of law. This is a very important act for me. Before talking about media, we have to talk about the rule of law. 2019 is not 2016, of course. In 2016, there were some high-profile elections. Now, on a national and international level, a certain preparation is underway. The institutions are much more active. If we are talking about supranational preparation, even the European Council is talking about a rapid alert system. We're talking about the need for coordinated approach in order to come up with legitimate and legal elections in May. And the European Parliament and the Commission are very active too. The Parliament in the recent weeks adopted a resolution that reminded us of the fact that 2 years have elapsed since the strategic communication report, which identified important factors related to disinformation and propaganda when we're talking about foreign interference. This resolution, to my mind, is very important from a political perspective. The Commission also has its role, because it deals with the matter of the approach. On an expert and political level, the Commission has discussed the issue of the approach. I refer to the topic, is it possible to have a centralized common action against disinformation? The Commission discusses both the legislative and non-legislative measures, and in the beginning it pointed out that at Brussels, the accent will be laid on non-legislative measures until their capacity is exhausted. So when we're talking about the center, about the centralized approach, we should necessarily mention all the initiatives related to media literacy, to the early warning system. But for the sake of comprehensiveness, we should say that the institutions are not inactive when we're talking about legislative measures as well. The Commission has warned us that it would perform very close and stringent monitoring on non-legislative measures. And if it is not satisfied with the result, it will not hesitate to use legislative measures. And recently we have seen that the Commission has outlined certain avenues of these measures. And President Plevneliev mentioned the role of the GDRP, and the Commission and the institutions furthermore act towards transparency of the financing of the political parties. There is a legislative measure. Regulation has been amended for the sake of requiring more transparency in financing. These measures go along with stricter sanctions. And there is also a requirement for transparency of the political advertising. In some strange way, this debate of the European Commission coincides with a statement of Mark Zuckerberg, who says that on a global level there is a need for legislative measures. This sounds strange because for quite some time the platforms did not wish any regulation. It turns out, however, that it is difficult to exist in a non-regulated world. And Zuckerberg mentioned 4 areas in which he would need for regulation. One is election, another one is data protection, the third one is the harmful and unauthorized content, and the third one, the last one, the transfer of data. All of them very interesting. But when we're talking about legislative measures, it seems to me that in the European Union, in the center, you can seek them on 2 levels. This seems important to me. One level is the traditional combating of disinformation. The Commission is operating there. The individual is protected there. The Commission has adopted a plan for combating disinformation, which includes identification of the disinformation, check of facts, and rebuttal. But there is also a second level, which is clearly formulated and which is quite different and leads to a different and more intensive response. What I mean here is the disinformation that is focused not on single individuals or single institutions, but on belittling and undermining the European values. This is disinformation aimed against democracy and its foundations, against the electoral process. We should clearly say that combating is a part of the security system of United Europe. And Bulgaria should be very active here. The European Parliament is one of the institutions that have identified the sources of threat in this second plane, and Kremlin was mentioned. We in Bulgaria know what the role of Kremlin is vis-à-vis European values. Bulgaria responds more timidly, but there are countries in the European Union that react in a very strong way as regards the media. The Balkan states, Latvia, Lithuania are among them. And in line with this is an amendment in the the media directive, which provides mostly for television. There are also provisions regarding the limitation of the 4 freedoms when necessary, the freedom of services. And it is also possible in case of hostile speech, in case of manipulations, to apply these. The Kremlin propaganda also stems or comes from televisions that are operational in the European Union. These are European media. Technically speaking, they're based in London and elsewhere. The media directive envisages a possibility for limiting the freedom of retranslation. We should have a look around in Bulgaria and see if there are such programs of a similar content to which the Bulgarian government has not responded. And on closing, I'd like to say a couple of words on platforms. Macron said that the means is the communication, platforms are the communications. That's what we can quite adequately say. Why platforms? Because they act quickly, they are viral, they reach hundreds of millions and billions of people. They act on a personal level, on an individual level. They act via the conventional media, or they outleap the media. I'm Trump. I don't use the big US TV networks. I act directly. Also, platforms are important, as studies say, because law is lagging behind them. That is, they operate in an area that is under-regulated. So the Union is now taking action in this respect. It is believed that platforms should be gradually regulated. It is very important and very interesting to compare the activities of the European Union regarding self-regulation and how the United Kingdom acts in the context of Brexit. Let me remind you of something that we expected with great curiosity and interest. It came out yesterday, the White Book to combat illegal content in the UK, 102 pages. Since yesterday, we've been reading responses, starting with Theresa May, the non-governmental sector, the media. Theresa May says we are putting a full stop to the time in which we hoped for self-regulation, hence the first signal. We are closely observing this process to draw our conclusions for Bulgaria. Will Theresa May say we are putting an end to self-regulation after the EU? Bulgaria, of course, is giving its input to self-regulation. We are introducing the GDPR, the acquis, and everything that these go along with. But what matters for me is that this issue should not be taken out of the agenda. The issue of combating disinformation should be high on the agenda because elections come and go, but the problem is there. And I started with, and I will close with the rule of law. Disinformation and the fact that it is possible is just a symptom. What we need is a robust media, democratic ecosystem. In support of what you said about the platforms, let me quote a study I read about yesterday or the day after, the day before. It is a marketing study which is indicative of how information is perceived and why platforms like Facebook are very important. It is a European study, about 60 plus percent of the people would buy something influenced by conversations with friends or influenced by recommendations by friends in Facebook and not by public figures. So if Stanley Cook says, this is the best camera, please buy it, you will say somebody bought you to say that, somebody paid you to say that. I'll listen to what my friends say. So this is one of the reasons why social networks are so important in the degree to which disinformation penetrates the minds of people. And let me now turn over to Ralitza, and of course, if you are willing to join in, you're welcome. My question is about the warfare of disinformation, but also the warfare of misinterpretations, because in many cases of propaganda, there is no entirely untrue facts. We don't say that the black is white. We say, yes, it is black, but, and then we struggle for the minds and hearts of the people, as Mr. Plevniliev said a little while ago. So we are talking about facts and interpretations. To continue with the example of the study and the importance of the platforms of the social media, I would say, yes, it is so indeed. And there are two factors that are crucial here. There are two big studies that prove this. One is that of Tom Nichols, which is the death of the expertise, U.S. expert in national security, who goes beyond his narrow expertise to study the issue. Why, for years now, people do not trust experts, and people are people rebel against the established knowledge, and even there is this flat Earth movement. And social networks are the golden terrain, the golden ground, the golden mean where this influence is exercised. There is also a study of the Massachusetts Technological Institute from last year. This is the biggest study on the social networks. Twitter was studied for the past 10 years. That is over its total length of existence. 4.5 million sharings of news stories have been traced by the researchers. They established that the fake news, or the news with untrue content, are disseminated faster. The probability of sharing them and disseminating them is greater. And what struck me is that they penetrate deeper in the network. What does this mean? This means that, for example, if CNN has 1 million followers and it publishes a certain piece of news, it reaches simultaneously 1 million people in Twitter. But if John publishes a piece of news which is wrong, which is not true, it is spread like a rumor from person to person in Facebook, for example, and this increases the probability of people believing in this piece of news. This is something that is used by the generators of anti-European propaganda. Of course, the Russian propaganda, which is very creative, comes up with great narratives, great media stories, like the case with the Lisa girl in Germany. But the form is very attractive. They use really existing threats, dreads, and fears. So the innovation is in the media product. You may remember a popular picture in Facebook about the childless European leaders that lead Europe to fail. To demise. In Facebook, this picture and this story was very popular. I saw this idea in Russian. I thought it was a Russian make. I saw it in RT, but then it was, I realized it was published in sites like Breitband. So the extreme rightist and conservative powers that President Plevniliev also referred to obviously joined hands with their Russian colleagues because they have similar interests. But this propaganda, this way of impact, only creates the favorable ground, the favorable soil for the actual activity to take place, as Professor Ugnyanova mentioned. When social media abandon in about in narratives like the European Union bans the snowman and edits the fairy tales. This only prepares the ground for certain politicians in this country to say that the European Union is like the Soviet Union, and that because of the sanctions against Russia, Bulgaria cannot export its agricultural products to the Russian market, and also that we are second-hand European, and that's why we get food that is second-hand or worse quality. Remember the story about the Istanbul Convention. It's entirely fabricated, and it was very easy to say that gay Europe is introducing some non-traditional aspects that are not typical for us. So we are not talking only about fake news. We're talking about fake narratives, about fake stories about the world we live in, fake explanations as to who is what in this world and what they fight for. This is the level we have arrived at. And these narratives, unfortunately, are very stable in our society already. Professor Nekova and I, she's sitting over there, carried out a study 2 years ago in 2017 during the election campaign for the early national elections. The topic was, what do politicians say in the 3 big TV stations on the foreign policy? Regarding the European Union, I'll mention 2 points from our study. One is that in Bulgaria is continuously advertised with its positive attitude to the EU. All Eurobarometer studies indicate this. When we have a look at this consensus, pro-European consensus, when we look at it through the political statements, in essence, it is broken down in such a way that the positive attitude to the EU is not more than 10% higher than the negative attitude, or more, or rather negative. So the politicians whose voice mattered at that time during that campaign said, yes, we are for EU membership, but they put us in the periphery. We are treated as a second-quality population. We don't have a voice, and Bulgaria should be a member of the European Union, but it should have a sovereign, let's say, energy policy or foreign policy. This is one of my favorites, an independent policy. Another thing that struck me as a result was that almost 50-50, with a small incline in on one direction. At that time, the debate was in relation to the White Book, so the White Paper. The question was whether Bulgaria, with its activities, determines whether it's in the center or in the periphery, or it was external forces like Brussels, the European leaders, the great the powers put us in the periphery. So 51 to 49. Was the opinion that the European Union sets us in the periphery, regardless of what we do. So this clearly indicates that political speech, political messages are fraught with problems. And it's not only the media that reflect these messages. That is why such narratives as the sanctions against Russia at that time and similar statements or messages that will appear now because of the second or substandard food is due to the fact that we are treated as substandard populations, these messages will continue to work during this campaign as well. In the social media, in the online space, very often there will be day-to-day matters, practical aspects of life, not purely political matter, but also children. Children are related to stronger emotions, to empathy, and that's why such propaganda narratives and anti-European ones will be pursued there.
I have a question. We are talking, we have concerns, rather, that close to 30% in the next European Parliament will contain nationals, which means that a substantial number of Europeans will be voting for these people. So the question here is how to recognize that this is a legitimate will of voters, and on the other hand, to recognize that they are to a major extent victims of propaganda. Professor Ognyanova. I don't believe that this is a matter to be discussed by media law expert, but how can we make a distinction between disinformation, mystification, and propaganda? It's rather difficult. When you change the tools to counteract something, in parallel, you have change in the disinformation tools. One of the drawbacks of disinformation countering is that we sort of boost disinformation generators to use even more creative tools and techniques. With the propaganda, there is a bit of a difference, simply because sources could be followed. What are the main sources of the narrative? However, when disinformation is concerned, things are different. It is unclear to what extent even artificial intelligence can be used for the purposes of disinformation. So we are faced with a very serious dual issue. We want to use technology for good purposes, to isolate, to identify, in order to counteract propaganda and disinformation. But we should never forget that the same tools and technology are in the hands of the malicious people. And this is to emphasize the difficulty we face with identification. Ms. van der Broeke, what do you have to say about this?
There were so many interesting things that I would like to react to, actually, but I'll try and limit to, as far as possible, to your question. Of course, as a civil servant for the European Parliament, all MEPs are legitimate. They're elected by the people. So that's the premise. Having said that, I do realize that in Bulgaria, the main concern is with the Kremlin and Putin. But let me be a bit contrary on this. I believe that European politicians are, and others are perfectly capable of creating disinformation themselves. And the three reasons, of course, are clickbait, like the Albanian cottage industry that we've seen during the American presidential elections, but also simply the business model of new media. If you want to sell a newspaper, you want some nice, juicy headline, and preferably a half-naked woman on the front page, which is exactly the model that the Brits have done. And I think that the UK is an excellent example of how this is not particularly from Russia coming in. Yes, there is a Russian influence, it's demonstrable, it's there, but I don't think it's even the most important thing. If you look at what happened in Britain for decades, their tabloids have said that with clear pieces of disinformation, like all military cemeteries in the UK have to carry the European flag and that kind of thing. And that is a clear example of jingoism to me. It's a certain class that wants to have a certain society, and the EU prevents that society. The EU takes care of labor standards, environmental standards, and it hinders a certain class of people in the UK. So that exists. It has existed. It will continue to exist. What you see is indeed underlying everything are certain particular narratives. In the case of the EU in general, countering and undermining, I think one of you mentioned that, destabilizing the EU are three main narratives. The one is it costs far too much money. Recognize that one? Yes, sure you do. Even though it's not even 1% of average GDP, that goes into the EU, the entire EU budget for 28 member states, and probably for some while still to remain 28. The second one is there are far too many bureaucrats. It's a whole bureaucratic thing. Well, all people in Brussels are even less than a particular ministry in France alone, in Paris, for one particular country. So even that is not true. And the third one is we make laws that are ridiculous. And the snowman, of course, is one example, because that's completely false, but also laws that are real. I don't know if you know the story about Penka the cow. You must do. Yes, well, there you go. And what people forget with that is that not just that it was a nonsensical story, and the cow hopefully has given birth by now to its calf, and they both live happily ever after. Well, maybe until they go to the butchers, as all cows do. But what they forgot was that there is legislation in place, there are rules in place to prevent mad cow disease, to prevent swine fever, by which hundreds of thousands of animals are being destroyed. So, to come back to the three main, so bureaucracy, too much money, and stupid rules. Those are you can always recognize that in all the stories. What you see nowadays most are the stupid rules. So what do you do against that? What we're trying to do, for instance, now is to develop a list of positive narratives, showing there are some very emotional videos that the Commission has produced already, which I think should be shortened, and we're working with them. But how do you then go against that? How do you spread that? As you said, if I send it out onto the official Twitter account or Facebook account, yeah, that's fine, but it's not going to help a lot. So we're going to see if we can do something with influencers. I mean, if a 4-year-old toddler can earn €1 million per year just unpacking toys, surely we must be able to spread these things which are emotional and have some value. I'm not too worried, to be honest. If you see that with a Eurobarometer, that 70% of people are concerned about disinformation, so they are aware of that. If we are able to also make clear how you can easily recognize it, if you also realize that most of the shares, people haven't even read themselves, they see a headline and they spread it, they don't even read it. I think there are many possibilities to do that. Coming back to the 30% and Russia and the national politicians, to me it's quite normal what is happening. National politicians are not going to say, oh, the EU is great, Brussels is doing a fantastic job, I can go home and just tend the rose garden. No, of course not. They have a position, they want to show that they're important. So there was always going to be this fight as soon as you touch on the most important parts of a nation state, It's foreign security, internal security, your tax base. Well, internal security, you've seen European arrest warrant and everything. It's already being Europeanized. Foreign security is difficult, but taxes would also already are moving that way. So of course, national politicians are going to go against that, and that's exactly what the nationalists are going to against. We want to be owners of our own policies. We want to be able to do that. And I think it's a legitimate concern. I think that's to start with. We should recognize that. That is something that is normal, it's logical. I don't think it is going to help anyone, but you should recognize it. So that, for me, is very important to do. And then I think what you will, and this is just a word of warning, I think what you will see in the election, what you've seen in previous elections, and it all ties in together here, what you see is that the focal point is going to be the topic of immigration. And everything ties in there. It's not being able to control your own borders anymore. It's stupid Brussels rules. We're giving far too much money. Everything, all the narratives come together in immigration. So I think we should really be aware of that particular one. Will we be able to prevent populists, and I can be having 30% or 40% or how many? I don't think so, to be fair, but that's my personal opinion. What I do know is that the European Parliament has clearly opted for a pro-EU campaign, institutional campaign, which makes sense in a way. If you're a European Parliament, you're not going to say, okay, let's do away with us. So, you know, that makes sense. But I think that for everybody it's important to realize all these things, the underlying narratives, that it's quite legitimate to be hesitant about giving away too much sovereign to others, giving more sovereignty away to others. But people should realize you get autonomy in return. You cannot do things on your own. You cannot, as a single country, keep swine fever out or bird flu or whatever. You have to act together. And that is something, again, I'm hopeful about that. I think more and more people will realize. I hope.
Окей, благодаря много. Искате ли да питате?
Thank you very much. Do you have any questions?
I would like to push back a bit on what you just said, because I think having just a positive narrative is not good enough anymore. Saying that things are okay and they're only going to get better is not very convincing. Speaking not only from Sofia point of view, speaking from actually pretty much any, and we have offices across Europe. And I really think that this campaign should have been about the risks much more than, you know, about how rosy it's going to be. Because the risks are, for the first time, much higher than they have been for European Parliament elections. And we did a survey showing that there is a complacent group of pro-Europeans who think, you know, that Europe works, so they don't need to do much. And they're not going to go and vote on the 26th of May. And this is going to be a big problem for all of us. And so we have to activate them. We have to make them realize that there is an issue. And to do that, we need to say that there is a very high risk that we get a self-hating European Parliament, that we get a lot of very important packages of legislation blocked, and that we're actually going to give room to voices who are anti-European in their core. This is one. And the second, I would like to push back also on your Russia point, because it's not about, you know, Russia or Kremlin advertising for themselves. I just saw this piece of news that 1 million Bulgarians think that there is some truth to the claim that the conspiracy of the pharmaceutical industry is behind the vaccinations. And this is a very large number. I mean, 1 million is a lot of people for this small country. This is not, and I'm sure Ralica can talk about this as well. This is part of this whole propaganda that none of this expert knowledge should be taken at face value. So even the vaccination is a conspiracy, and all of this kind of started through those openings created by Russian propaganda. So I think actually the danger is much larger than simply, pushing for a certain geopolitical interest.
If I may react to that, the first thing about complacency. Well, first of all, the very fact that I do the work that I do means that we're not, in that respect, we're not complacent. And in the real election campaign, the idea is to target especially what we call weak abstainers. So it's people who indeed are quite happy with the EU, but on the day of elections think it's raining, or, oh, my daughter has a birthday party, and then don't go because they're complacent. It's particularly those people that we're trying to target. And also go to the website. This time I'm voting, if you haven't done so yet, because not only can you there have all kinds of information that might interest you, but you can also say that, hi, I'm a volunteer, I'd like to help and with events, or I want to organize my own events, can you help me? So that is quite a mobilizing campaign that we're doing. There are at the moment, I think, 220,000 people who have registered on the website, and there are some 2,500 volunteers actively volunteering to help on that. So I hear what you're saying, but that is absolutely not what we're doing at the campaign. On the contrary, we're doing exactly what you mentioned, targeting the complacent, as you call them, Europeans. About Russia, as I said before, yes, the Russian influence is there, but I think myself, personally, that if you focus too much on that, you forget what we have homegrown. And homegrown, you mentioned, it is there, and it's very important, and I think we should not overlook that by, staring too much at the Kremlin side. You mentioned the vaccination. This started with highly educated people who were worried about pharmaceutical firms, rightly or wrongly. And that had nothing to do with Russia. That Russia then starts to use this and to amplify it, I think that is quite clear. But it's there already. In my own country, which is I'm from the Netherlands, by the way, there's now in The Hague, where the government is, there are 4 cases of measles and that is amazing. And you see it everywhere. The WHO published figures recently how this is not the Kremlin's fault. They are using it, but we did it ourselves. And I think we should recognize that ourselves, because otherwise we can't do anything about it.
Zapowiadaj.
Thank you. I'd like to make a comment on something that I think will be used by the nationalists or by populists. Historically, a large number of people fail to see that the national sovereignty was established, or was beginning to be established, in the 17th century. And the European integration as a topic was raised in the 1950s. So there is this difference of 4 centuries of establishment of state sovereignty, and there's only a certain number of decades of establishing the establishing the European idea. This, of course, will be used by nationalists. Of course, we have to see our mistakes. RT, or the Iranian television, published only what the US and UK states and societies have generated in negative terms. We're talking about the media and what can be done. But what can we do about the audience itself? What can we do about people who say, I know that this piece of news is not true, but I will share it because it is consistent to the largest extent with my personal opinion on that matter. This cannot be combated. This cannot be done away with by the media. We should have short-term and long-term objectives in this respect, and we should turn to education from the earliest age. I wish I could agree with Professor Nekov on the role of education, but I would also like to add the reason for the existence of public media in the European Union. Public media are a phenomenon of European origin. Only in the European Union they have such a mission. The mission is written in primary law. Public media exist and are funded by public resources for the sake of working for the democratic, social, and cultural needs of people who, if not public media, would have a mission and care and the funding to deal with the democratic health of society in at complicated times. Otherwise, I fully agree that media literacy is a long-term task. What we are planning in schools now will yield results much later. And we are in a situation when we have to deal with adults with their digital competence, because elections are 1 month away. And the program should be both long-term one and short-term one. There should be certain measures for the people that will vote or refuse to vote in a month's time. Thank you. I thank my colleagues and interlocutors for the exhaustive and interesting opinions they have shared, and I thank you too. Now we shall continue with the next panel, which concerns the mechanics of the elections. Mr. Dimitar Dimitrov is dealing with that, and I'd like to turn over to that set of panelists. Thank you.
let's proceed with the second panel.
During this panel, we will be talking about the mechanics of the elections. Quite often, it proves to be very important. As we have already mentioned, Europe has rarely found itself in such a situation where there is a feeling that there is too much of an interest on the part of external players. The 28 elections in the member states will provide a good chance in this respect. Until several years ago, technology in elections was regarded as the silver bullet in solving all the issues in the process. Until the American presidential elections, when it turned out that this is not without its problems. And the leaders that have affinity to centralizing power and reducing political pluralism used to boast of this technology. Now we are faced with the issue, what should we do with them? France and the Netherlands and some other countries have already revised their technology. They have done away with online voting and machine counting of ballots. But what we should say is that the visible aspects, technology-wise, are not the only ones. There are processes that use technologies, and even if we don't have online voting or machine counting, there are still aspects that can be at risk of being attacked, particularly if we are not aware of that. That is why we have invited here people that are knowledgeable about this topic. Mr. Peter Wolf, who is working for one of the best organizations in the world dealing with studying elections, Mr. Alexander Schlick, who is the head of the election department of OSCE, and Mr. Dimitar Dimitrov, who is an assistant professor and member of the Central Election Commission, and Mr. Thomas Shanisu, who is from the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, who is also involved in technology studies. I'd like to ask a quick question in expectance of a short answer. What is your assessment of the level of threat regarding these elections? Indeed, the European elections so threatened or jeopardized by external or foreign interference? Mr. Wolf.
In the first session, we heard 2019 is not 2016, and I think this is also very true when it comes to the mechanics of the elections. You already mentioned the elections in Europe are not as high-tech as one might maybe assume, so the countries that gave up on things like electronic voting or even online voting is maybe even higher than the number of countries that are using those systems at the moment. And I still remember discussing with some European election administrators in 2016, before all of the US elections discussion and so on, what are you doing about cybersecurity in your electoral processes? And a lot of them just told me, well, we don't have online voting, so cybersecurity is not really a concern in our country. Now, of course, this has changed a lot. After the US elections in 2016, there has been a lot more attention on the security of the technical infrastructure of electoral processes. And when we started research more in-depth on this in 2017, what I heard from many countries and many election administrations was actually, we'd really be interested in this research, we'd like to participate, but mostly to learn from others, and not so much that we can, there's not so much that we can contribute at this point. Now, I think this has clearly changed. A lot of countries have clearly stepped up their cybersecurity preparations, have realized this is not only about electronic voting, this is especially also about the results process, and even if official results are maybe still going through a paper process and official protocols, preliminary results are usually processed with electronic means, are published online, and those are all, of course, surfaces that can be attacked. But again, many countries have stepped up their preparations, have stepped up their cybersecurity. The European Union has conducted several activities as well. They have published last year already the Compendium of Cybersecurity in Elections, which I think is quite useful as a guide of what can be done at the technical level here. But to some extent, that also maybe shifts then the attention from not only looking at the hard risks of hacking elections, also towards what we've discussed before, disinformation, the risk of more an attempt to undermine the credibility of the electoral process overall, which means it's not maybe even necessary to manipulate results data to try to come up with fake results at the end of the process, but more trying just to show vulnerabilities in the process, DDoS attacks, trying to bring websites of election administrations down, defacing websites could be threats like this, or even without hacking, just putting out claims that the elections process is insecure, that the electoral infrastructure can be manipulated. So that's clearly maybe the main worries that a lot of election administrations in Europe have at this point. And also interestingly, I remember one election administration from Europe telling me they're also worried about maybe a gap between the perceived electoral integrity, which might still be quite high, and the actual integrity where bits and pieces, even though maybe not very significant bits and pieces, but sometimes things can just go wrong. And if that is being exploited, if somebody strategically points at all of those small things that one could criticize, that this could also be used as a way of undermining trust. So again, attacking the perception may be a more risk factor than trying to steal the election by changing results figures at the moment.
I fully agree with Peter that there has been a lot
Напълно.
for security recently. I wouldn't draw the line from the 2016 though. I think it has been in public domain since a while back before that. It was probably not termed as cybersecurity. It was not a securitized concept, but it was about the more focus on the trust in processes that are digitalized for a while. It's true that it's not only about casting the ballots, it's not only about the counting the votes, but the technology is used throughout the electoral process, starting even and most fundamentally with the voter registration. It's digitalized more and more, and that has been one of the focal areas in the US elections, where the discussion has not only been about the interference in the vote counting or casting of the ballots, but also fundamentally into the discussion has been focusing on the voter registration processes and hacking into the voter data, which then is very illustrative, and that's the point that I really want to make, that the discussion is not only about the cyber threats to the results or the processes. The discussion is and should be about the trust of the general public in the electoral process as such. Why has it been such a prolific discussion on voter registration hacking in the US? Because voter registration and enfranchisement of the voters there is already a hot political topic. So the discussion into who is eligible to vote maybe is not related to technology, but the moment you bring the technological element into it, those malicious actors are playing up the already existing grievances and already existing disagreements about how the elections function. So in the end of the day, it's all about the general public trust in the elections as a whole, rather than the specific vulnerabilities of specific elements in the process. And that has a lot to do with how the technology has been perceived and is perceived now. It is true that maybe 10 years ago, the technological solutions were often seen as a panacea for all sorts of problems. It is now seen from both sides. The moment you increase the use of technology as the election administration, you increase the vulnerabilities that the electoral process is open to. We, from the side of the OCOD, we're always talking to the election administrations with two fundamental questions. The first one is, what is the exact problem that you are trying to solve by using technology? And you'd be surprised that very often there is no direct answer to that. Very often it is more of a political decision and a decision to look better, to use the technology, to be modern, to be in the group of front runners, to be smart, to eliminate the human component in it. But when you look in details into it, you obviously see how much humans are still involved. The second question that we always ask is the use of technology. Is this something that you want to do to create trust in elections? And that's a bit of a leading question. Very often
the answer is usually no.
The answer is usually yes from the election management bodies. But what we say back is that to use technology, you need trust. It's not that technology creates trust, but for technology to be successful, you need to have the trust. So I think this is the angle from which we can look at the upcoming European Parliament elections, and that is where we need to analyze whether there is public trust in elections, both as a technical process, but also as a political process. And after that, we will be able to see which elements of the process are vulnerable for perceived or real threats, because the malicious actors are smart. They hit where it hurts. And where it hurts is where the people are lacking trust. And with this, I'll close for now.
Господин Димитров, нашия процес не е толкова електрифициран, да видим.
Процеса.
Първо нека да кажа едно.
Let me first start with a sentence that I will express my personal views, not on behalf of the Central Election Commission, not as the collective body that the Commission represents. The Bulgarian case. Don't think that there is any other country that had two referenda regarding electronic voting system. With respect to Bulgarian elections, there are some drawbacks that are quite visible. Ballot counting, and also there are some in some districts. There are some let's call them indecent approaches. So, however, all these facts lead to deterioration of trust. However, technology of course creates technological risk. And how could we respond to those risks? Of course, politicians are much more interested to avoid any risk. Citizens are also interested in that. And also, politicians tend to use technology to mobilize voters in the course of their campaign, especially in marginalized groups. So, I have been very adamant about that. The administration of the election process will not resolve all the issues that we have. I don't believe it is a defect of democracy that African Americans support African American candidates. If we look at the local dimension of this fact, we can have if we have local elections in a village where one of the candidates is a Turkish-speaking person, and the village has 90% Turkish Bulgarians of Turkish origin, that, of course, the probability of this candidate winning is close to 100%. So what would technology change or improve? Let me give you an example. We will have 3,000 touchscreen voting machines for the purposes of these elections. We will need to have also a ballot sheet. However, it is a paradox that in Bulgaria some people insist on having only machine voting and only machine voting. But if we go if we take this avenue, that who will certify the voting machines? What are the institutions available to do that? There are some mathematicians with the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, with the Faculty of Mathematics, the Bulgarian at the Sofia University, who can do that. But unfortunately, this particular topic is turning into pre-election campaign message, because we are the carriers of progress, of advancement, simply because we insist on using technology in voting. But those people actually do not anticipate the risk. It is not during election to test the reliability of technology. Elections are about trust, about setting the grounds and building trust. When you want to convey a party message, things are a bit different. Of course, there might be some deviations in the proper, smooth election process running, but this is a tiny percentage, and technology would hardly support and make it smoother. I believe that the Dutch Internal Ministry of Interior explained in a very simple manner that they will not allow using machines. Well, it takes time. After the election day is over, it takes time to count the ballots, and you have preliminary results, then you have final results. Within 72 hours would hardly disturb the future of the next 4 years. So I believe that here I'm touching upon the false news dwelling. I cannot explain to the president that if there are 4,000 or 50,000 invalid ballots, that would hardly deviate substantially the general outcome of the election. And technology can hardly resolve this. And I don't think that remote areas or marginalized groups will pay any attention to those to new digital technologies. Sometimes messages are not understood. It's not the reason that people do not comprehend the message conveyed. It is not for the people to blame. It is for the conveyor that the person that actually passes on the message that is to blame. And I believe that this bears a risk. I don't believe technology is hardly the tool that will resolve electoral process issues. On the contrary, looking at Brexit, technology can actually lead to a devastating outcome. Thomas.
Your organization has a program that is trying to find the main vulnerabilities in the processes over Europe or world, I don't know.
The world.
Yeah, and those are not the vulnerabilities only in terms of technology, but also on the human factor. That's right.
That's right. So, well, maybe I will take a step back on this, and I think there were, over the last few months, there were two elections that were really interesting. It's Estonia and Ukraine. Estonia was 3 months ago, and Ukraine was last week. These are two elections where all experts were expecting things to happen. And I remember reading headlines. If you want to know what will happen in the European election, look at Estonia, look at Ukraine. Same thing in the US. And these were really boring elections. In terms of hard cyber, nothing happened. There's a few possible explanations for that. Maybe they were low-profile elections and not interesting, but that's one argument. The other argument is that actually the cost of an attack on the electoral process, on the electoral commission, had got a little bit higher, right? It's adversarial. They calculated that it would take a little bit more effort to attack these elections. And looking at this election in the EU, it's a really complicated process. Adversaries are going to try to find the soft spot, not the hard spot. If you look at previous attacks, DDoS against Electoral Commission, well, it's 2019. Pretty much people have figured out how to protect against DDoS, right? So they might try again, but it's unlikely to be the soft spot anymore. It's going to be harder. It's going to cost more money to conduct a successful DDoS attack. So you need to look at your risk analysis a little bit more carefully and a little bit more broadly. And that's why cyber attack, you need to go a little bit beyond just the Electoral Commission. You need to look at what's going to be the cheapest way to disrupt an election. If the website of the Electoral Commission has become very well secured, then it's going to be something else. It may be political parties, it may be a disinformation campaign. So the threat really got a little bit more broader than just the hard cyber security protection of an EMB.
Сега ще задам супер конкретен въпрос.
I'll ask a very specific question now. If the state of Bulgaria has problems with its list of voters and it has such an issue, would you recommend or advise Bulgaria to develop an electronic online voters list? So would you advise Bulgaria to introduce some kind of online voting, even if it is restricted, only limited online voting?
we've got a few issues here, right? We've got voter registration, we've got possibly online voting, voting machines, and then the entire risk of cyber hacking, foreign interference, and so on. It's quite interesting, of course, the specific debate in Bulgaria about voting machines, about online voting, and so on. And certainly, as Alex has mentioned, and previous speakers as well, a lot of experience has been gathered about those technologies. Certainly, electronic voting cannot be seen as a silver bullet, as has been stated here, especially now in controversies around the cybersecurity of elections. It can even be harder to explain why we should trust those technologies, what the measures are that have been introduced to secure those technologies. So certainly one would have to be careful when expecting miracles from voting technologies. In fact, there's even another element that comes into play when introducing new voting technologies, and that is that they are sometimes seen as a real game changer by electoral stakeholders, which in itself can create resistance. A lot of trust in elections is also based on predictability and a continuous process. So if you introduce a game changer, such as electronic voting, that in itself, no matter how good or bad it is, can already create distrust in the process. But again, for the European picture, which is, I think, what we somehow want to discuss as well, this is a bit of an exotic example as well. Online voting or electronic voting is not so big in the rest of Europe, actually countries, and we heard about the Netherlands pulling back from electronic voting already many years ago. France just last year in the light of cybersecurity concerns. So it's actually, many European countries are actually seeing less technology at the moment as a bit of a security asset in just in the debate that we have, even a psychological asset. So certainly no silver bullet to be expected from electronic voting. Voter registration is, of course, a separate thing. I'm not exactly sure where Bulgaria stands at this one. Of course, there is a lot that technology can contribute there as well, centralized voter registers and so on. But I think it's going a little bit off the cyber security bit as a whole. One thing I wanted to mention, because it's also something we have clearly seen as part of our work with election administrations, what can be done about all kinds of cyber threats, and a little bit linking also to what Thomas has said, a lot of the threats are going actually beyond what the election administration can be responsible for. And so what we've seen is that it's really getting more and more important to have cooperation between national agencies on electoral security, on electoral cybersecurity. So not only look at the election administration to fix those issues, but look at a broad spectrum of actors all the way from cybersecurity expert bodies in the countries, all the ministries involved from defense to Ministry of Interior and Foreign Affairs. A lot of actors that all play a little bit of a role in this. And what we've seen a lot is that countries, as they have reviewed their cyber posture, they've realized there was very weak cooperation between those agencies in place. They really had to often start from scratch, finding out who are the actors responsible, what are the mandates, who are the important people to talk to when an incident occurs, and then also start preparations for the elections, maybe joint planning, information sharing, intelligence sharing, developing joint scenarios, and also very importantly, joint communication strategies, because ahead of the elections, but then also in case an incident happens during elections, a uniform message explaining what's happening, first what is done to prevent any incidents, but then also what is done in case something goes wrong, is very important. And so interagency collaboration, actually one of the factors that has clearly emerged as an important issue nationally and also internationally. And also again, highlighting what the European Union does here. They have recommended the setup of those national election cooperation networks, which have been put in place in pretty much all countries of the European Union already. National focal points as well for cooperation at the European Union level. And we've also seen last week the first cyber exercise actually happening at the EU level, which tries those cooperations, I think, are very important steps towards more security.
Same question.
On Bulgaria, and any other country that we work in as the OCODR, we do not preempt the sovereign decisions of the countries. If the country decides to go a certain way, let it happen. We will speak through our subsequent reports, whether that worked or not. There will be an assessment. What we recommend, however, is specific considerations to be taken when a decision is made. There are two specific recommendations on the use of new voting technologies in Bulgaria in our last report from 2017. One of them is about the capacity of the Central Election Commission to actually run and manage this process. The other one is about actually bringing the processes into the legal domain as well. the law needs to correspond to what are the developments. But I'll leave it at that. The recommendations are clearly formulated, and I advise to consult what is in the report on that. But I just want to supplement a bit more on a sort of Europe-wide scale. You're right, Peter. The departure from the technology is done to, in a way, to protect the elections from possible threats. It is, in a way, quite often a political decision as well, just to say we want to be safe, there is a threat coming, and we eliminate the threat by eliminating the entry points for it. What is sometimes lacking in this discussion is the detailed discussion of what is actually the threat and how credible it is. It is a bit of a risk analysis on face value, but if you look at what risk analysis is about, you have to analyze not only the risks and the possible detrimental effects, but also the likelihood of something materializing. And that is sometimes more of a taken for granted. There are bad guys there trying to get our elections. Whether they are actually interested in doing that, that's a different kind of question, but it's more in a sort of a political analysis realm. What I think is extremely important to ensure in countering the cyber threats in elections is the transparency of what is expected and what measures are being taken. I fully agree that the interagency collaboration is something that absolutely needs to be strengthened. We saw that happening in Estonia. We saw that happening in Ukraine very, very much. The roundtables on cyber threats to elections in Ukraine have included at least 8 to 10 different agencies, some of which have names that can't be even remembered. There's very highly specialized agencies involved. And there were steps taken as well in many countries to publicize what is being discussed. Of course, you know, once the security services get involved, it's not in their default terms of reference to publicize what they're doing. And we fully understand, you know, intelligence is there to be kept until it needs to be released. But when we're talking about a process of a public nature, it's hugely important to speak about what are the threats that you're expecting, because the threat is effective not only when it works, but also when it probably didn't work, but something happened. And to be able to say what happened and what did not happen, the administrators of elections, other agencies need to be talking about what are they preparing for and how are they preparing for it. And that is sometimes missing. Sometimes when the threat does not materialize, people are saying, yeah, all fine, we're done, it hasn't happened. But what hasn't happened? What were you expecting? What were the risks that you were anticipating? Because this is what the public needs. The public is not operating on the same level of technical sophistication. The public understands the threats as a political concept rather than a technical concept. And the communications from the administrators of elections and other bodies involved need to be using simple terms, not just the terms that are gigantic and broad, like disinformation or cybersecurity. Let's go into details in that and talk to the public in simple terms of what exactly are we expecting. And that is something that needs to be probably the next step in countering possible threats as well. Not only interagency collaboration, but also the transparent collaboration and transparency with regard to possible threats and actions taken to mitigate those.
Okay, thank you. Thomas, we have interagency cooperation and the public included. Do you have other advice and solutions?
No, but just a few quick comments, nothing really new, but cybersecurity is very difficult. I mean, private companies, big private companies, governments, everybody has been getting it more or less wrong to some extent for many years. And these irreasonable expectations that EMBs and commissions can get it right and can secure everything on their own. I think we've passed that, at least in Europe. It's still there in a few other places, but in Europe, I think all commissions are expected to collaborate with government. But I don't think it's yet easy everywhere. I don't know how it is here in Bulgaria, but the transparency factor and why do you have Secret Service people inside the Electoral Commission on election day? I mean, that's a question, right? There are different ways state agencies can support the MB during election days. There are many ways. It can be probes on the network. It can be special cybersecurity response people on the premises. It can be cameras on the data centers to verify who is accessing what, the cameras directly on the keyboard. And there are lots of different things that can be done and need to be considered. I don't think it's yet really straightforward how Electoral Commission and cybersecurity state agencies collaborate, even in Europe. And I think that's an important element for future discussion on how the process can be further secure and how we can progress on this direction.
Because your program is kind of evaluating also the human factor. Do you have to share something on that?
So with IFS, we started to work a little bit more extensively on technology and cyber security risk. And as I was saying before, I mean, the attack surface of an election is really broad. It's not just a data center that could be compromised. And if the data center might be secure, then adversaries will try to disrupt it in other way. It can be attacking the human factors. Are you people paid enough? The people working in the data center, the commissioners, I mean, anybody. Are they paid enough to do their job properly? Is the legal framework sufficient to ensure that the people have the tools and the authorization to do what they need to do to secure the election? So we're really trying to look a little bit more broadly than just, okay, is this data center secure? And look at the responsibilities of the people. Are they well established? The capacity of the people. Do they have the trainings? Do they have the staffing they need? The legal framework as well. And try to look a little bit beyond just the technical. Evaluate the risk. And I think in terms of risk, things are moving, and they're moving really fast. What happened in 2016, 2017, things are going to be different this time around. And 2016 was a lot of DDoS attacks on EMBs. We had a lot of spear phishing on political parties. I mean, that was the trend. Most likely, I mean, there have been progress, especially in Europe, to mitigate these threats. So there are going to be other risks that are going to move up the hierarchy of risk. And that's something really interesting to try to find what is the next soft spot if we've mitigated those risks.
Okay, thank you.
Just one quick.
In the Bulgarian election administration process, there is no weak spot. What I have understood so far by the supporting ICT and the supporting system, there is no way to affect the system apart from this portion, which in fact allows Bulgarians living in foreign countries to vote electronically. Everything else is on paper, and it is and the procedure put in place is well secured, and the risks are brought down to literally zero. However, in Bulgaria, the right to vote is a universal right, and everyone is entitled to vote. Sometimes, however, there are misuses. However, this is portion of the election that is not associated with the election day. I have always liked the countries and admired, in fact, the countries that maintain voters' register. Because it is about the right of each and every citizen to vote, but to be entered into the register, it is important. Bulgaria is not a country that provides for any oppression or suppression of voting rights, as is the case in some other countries. In that sense, Bulgaria is a very liberal country. However, the lists are diverse and they require work. I will now give the floor to questions, and I address myself to the audience. If there are no questions, we can close the panel. Mr. Dimitrov is a busy person, so he needs to administer the European elections. Thank you very much for your participation. Like to extend my gratitude to
from different parts of Europe. I think the discussions were actually quite interesting, and what Professor Dimitrov just said about the Bulgarian election was very reassuring. So this was good news. But overall, I think the issue of what we do with the channels of information and what we do with the messages themselves is going to preoccupy us in the coming month, but also the months after the European Parliament elections, because obviously the political core is the most critical one, and both ECFR, but also our partners from the European Parliament and the Commission representation here in Bulgaria will continue working on that and trying to tackle that. And we hope to see you again soon. Thanks a lot.